Thank you for joining me today. I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. I'm very happy today to be speaking with one of my favorite film critics of all time, J. Hoberman. He just completed his third book of a trilogy, which is called Make My Day, Movie Culture in the Age of Reagan. This follows the dream life, movies, media, and the mythology of the 60s, and an army of phantoms, American movies, and the making of the Cold War. If you haven't yet heard of Hoberman's work, you've probably seen it. He's been writing for the Village Voice for a long time. He's also appeared in Artforum, London Review of Books, The Nation, and the New York Review of Books. This work in particular is a very cool analysis of how films both sort of reflect what's going on in their cultural and political time period, as well as, in some sense, influence, especially with Reagan, who was obviously one of the first Hollywood presidents and seemed to like to quote from Westerns and other major films of the time. So this is an important book, of course, both for thinking about the 1980s and Reagan, as well as the current situation we find ourselves in with media and politics and the intertwining of those two things. I don't think he necessarily knew at the time how influential this book might be, but it definitely is a worthwhile read, even if you're not particularly interested in the 1980s, because it says so much in retrospect about what's been going on in the last few years as well. So Jay, thank you so much for being on the show and for speaking to me today. Maybe we can start with sort of a summary of what you were doing. I know this is the completion of a trilogy for you, so Make My Day, in a sense, wraps up a large project, but also works in and of itself as a book. So what were you setting out to do for Make My Day, as well as the trilogy of books that this completes?
Okay, well, there's a kind of organic quality to how the trilogy came about. Initially, there was only going to be one book, and I got the idea for that, I would guess, around 1990 or so. The book was going to be called Found Illusions, and what I was going to do was I was going to take one movie from each presidential election year, from 1948 through 88. And do a chapter on that. I started working on it, and it became clear to me that I wanted to deal with more than one movie, and that I didn't want to just restrict myself to presidential election years, although I wanted to talk about the relationship between Hollywood movies and American politics throughout. After that, it became apparent that, over 40 years, it just wouldn't work as a single volume. So my editor suggested that I just take a chunk out of it to work on. And being the kind of writer who likes to do the easiest thing first so that there's something there, I decided to do what would have been the middle of the book, which is the 60s, because that's a period when I was a young person and a teenager. So, of course, it's endlessly interesting to me. So that's how I wrote the middle section, The Dream Life. After that, I went back to the origins of the Cold War for an army of phantoms. I did a lot of research, and that was fascinating for me, digging out the minutiae of the blacklist and other things that were going on in Hollywood during that period. And then after that, I did the last installment on the 80s, which is a funny way of coming full circle, because that's what I thought of first. In other words, the idea for this book came right out of the Reagan presidency, and courses that I was teaching and some articles that I was writing in The Voice about the relationship between Reagan and popular culture, and Reagan as somebody who was schooled in the media who became president. And then that volume presented other difficulties for me in that I was not only conscious during the 80s, but I was a working film. So I reported on these movies, so to speak, firsthand. And in the previous volumes, I had paid a certain amount of attention to contemporary reviews of films, because it's really one of the only ways you can have of finding out how a movie was seen in its own moment. But in this case, I was one of those people who was reporting on it, and it took me a while to figure out how I was going to integrate myself into the narrative, but I finally did. And so that's how the books came about. If you want, I can go into how the trilogy evolved, because I'm also the kind of writer who learns of things as I'm working on them.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot I want to ask you about this book, but as the trilogy evolved, as you were working on the connection, I'm interested in how you would describe the connection between popular culture and film, because in the intro to Make My Day, you say that it's not a work of film criticism, and it's not, strictly speaking, a history. And you kind of do these parallel lines where you describe what's going on in politics, in election years especially, as well as what's going on in the culture more generally. And then you also describe films and their production and their reception, and you kind of weave these things together. Well, I'm curious how you would phrase it, because I don't think you're claiming that the films made these things happen in the general popular culture or in election years, but they're also not completely separate, of course. And so I'm wondering if you could say a bit about the connection you feel exists between film, culture, and politics.
Sure. Well, in a general sense, I think that the movie industry, Hollywood, American politics, or American politicians have something in common, or at least they did. And that was to generate a consensus. In other words, both movie producers and politicians are, I think, concerned with creating scenarios or advancing scenarios that are going to appeal to the greatest possible segment of the population. That's one thing that I took as a starting point. Now, in terms of influence, I mean, I think that there's a relationship. However, I would see, developments in politics and movie scenarios as being parallel in the sense that you could see them as symptoms, and they're symptoms of the same thing. In Make My Day, the key movie in many respects is Ghostbusters. I see Ghostbusters as the quintessential Reagan era movie for a number of reasons. But I don't think that Reagan directly inspired Ghostbusters, nor do I think that Ghostbusters in any sense created Reagan. I would say that Reagan's appeal and the appeal of that movie are related. They come out of the same sort of social flux or dynamic.
Yeah, and maybe you could say a little bit more about Ghostbusters then and how that relates, because one of the things I'm interested in is that you go through a number of films, of course, and I'm not sure exactly how many films are produced every year these days, but there's hundreds, if not thousands, of films that you could choose to talk about when thinking about the 80s. What makes Ghostbusters stand out?
Well, of course, each movie is a story all its own, and I have reasons, always for talking about the movies that I talk about, some of which are intuitive. But I would say that the year 1984 came a great symbolic importance, obviously because of the Orwell novel. I mean, now it's so long ago at this point that it would be hard to imagine that people were thinking about 1984 and what did it mean and this, that, and the other thing, and anticipating it in various ways. And it was also, of course, an election year, the year that Reagan ran for the second time. So there are a cluster of movies that came out during the summer of 1984, which I find significant. Some of them are overt in their politics. I mean, Red Dawn would be the best example of that. And also, in a way, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Although it presents itself in the guise of a kind of innocent entertainment, it's really not so innocent in its view of the world. Ghostbusters turns up in the middle of the summer, and it's kind of a sleeper. It's a comedy that overperforms tremendously. And that to me is significant because, I thought at the time, and I think now, that it's not really all that funny. There's something else that's going on in that movie that made people respond to it so profoundly. And that's still the case. I mean, parenthetically, I would say that the whole sort of online tumult that was caused by the female version of Ghostbusters signifies that something else is going on with that movie. I mean, it's kind of an irrational allegiance to that film that was felt by these online trolls. Anyway, I think that the movie had an appeal beyond the fact that it was funny. And part of that is in the attitude that it expresses. I mean, I could say that on the one hand, it's related to the movies that were produced by Spielberg and Lucas and their epigones during that period, in that it's all about a sense of wonder and the supernatural and, the supernatural in some cases in everyday life. And it concerns that, but it doesn't really make fun of that belief. It makes fun of the movies that support that belief. So I don't see it as being critical the way that something like Gremlins, which also came out that summer, could be seen as it's critical. It's not. Then it advances a kind of knowing cynicism, which you really see in the Bill Murray persona most clearly. so cynical that you can't really even get to the bottom of it. The movie, in a way, is even cynical about itself, if you think about it. But to reduce it down to its essence, what it's about, these guys who make a fortune by inventing a false need and capitalizing on it. I mean, if you remember, the ads in the movie are, we'll believe you. We're willing to believe you. That's what they're selling, their clients, a belief in paranormal or supernatural effects.
Mm-hmm.
The people who got the best review of that movie that I found at the time was in the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, who just said that this movie is like business school perfect. They really got it. They saw it as like an incredible, sort of business plan. And the movie saw itself that way. It's all about merchandising. The merchandising is even in the movie. And then it was fantastic in terms of its ancillary devices. So there's that. And what they're selling, they refer to as the essential defense science of the coming decade or something. I'm sorry, I forget the exact term they have for it. So they don't have to mention Star Wars, and they may not even have been thinking of Star Wars, although the movie was in production during 1983, which was the year that there was a lot of talk about Star Wars, Reagan's.
Yeah, Reagan's Star Wars, just to clarify,
Reagan's
right?
Star
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Reagan's Star Wars, of course. The SDI, which, again, took its name from a popular movie. And Reagan always pretended to resent that, that they were trivializing his plan. And, he would complain, and then he would say, but the force is with us. You know what I mean? So he would wink. This is like a very Bill Murray maneuver, I think. He winks and he says, yes, it's great that it's we're basing this on a movie, or that you're making this connection. Okay, so if you look at where the conflict is in the movie, where the problem is, it's the, well, for one thing, they're very contemptuous of the university. They're based initially on Columbia, which, for people of a certain age like myself, I mean, Columbia is really almost synonymous with 1968. That's the school where there was, the great uprising. So they're there. They're contemptuous of it. They say, oh, I've worked in the private sector. They expect results as if there's nothing, possibly useful that could be going on in the university setting. And their opponent is this guy from the Environmental Protection Agency, who's of their generation. I mean, this is really interesting. He's not like an old fuddy-duddy. I mean, he's a guy he's even kind of iconographically, somewhat hippie. He's got a beard and so on. I mean, so he, like they, is a kind of former hippie. But he's one who has made the mistake of taking this stuff seriously. He hasn't made the leap into, sort of joyful cynicism that Bill Murray and his cohort have, which I see as something analogous to Reaganism too. So, I mean, there's an attitude in Ghostbusters, this kind of, what me worry attitude, a kind of that I saw as very close to the kind of Reagan mania that was in evidence during the summer of 1984, and that it seemed worthwhile to parse what it was about this movie that people found so appealing. And if you, in terms of its own moment, I do believe that for a while it was the top grossing, it was the only one of the top grossing 10 movies during that period that wasn't directed by either Spielberg or Lucas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering, as you were sort of exploring that relationship between, well, Reagan and Ghostbusters in this case, did you find the experience of doing that different than the previous work you had done on earlier generations? Because, like you said, you'd been writing reviews for the Village Voice, you'd been participating in this, and you had a personal knowledge of the sort of reception of Ghostbusters and the cultural moment of the time. How did that differ from earlier things when you might be looking at, say, a movie from the 50s where you don't have any personal connection?
Well, of course, I could draw on my own sense of the moment. I mean, back in the 50s, really what I remembered in some sort of visceral way was the Davy Crockett craze and the opening of Disneyland, or the, premiere of the TV show Disneyland. And these were things that, that I experienced as a 6-year-old. But I still, had some sense of that as it being like a big deal from a 6-year-old's perspective, and even had a kind of intimations that it was a generational adventure. I mean, I could say that was much truer of events in the 60s when I was older. I mean, things like the Kennedy assassination, or Dr. Strangelove, which made a huge impression on me when I was 15, or any number of things that happened later in the 60s. So there was a part of me that could connect with these things. But we're talking about other, films, earlier films in the 50s. No, I had to sort of get this from reading or from research for the most part. When we got to the 80s, then it was, something we were dealing with films which I actually had to think about when they came out. Films in the 60s, I guess I thought about some of them, but a lot of them, I saw a lot of Westerns, some I liked, some I didn't. I didn't necessarily think about why one Western would be more resonant than another until I went back and thought about the period.
Did it make it easier, though, or harder when you were thinking about films that you had actually already written about as a critic?
Well, it made it easier in some respects in that I had already, in most cases, articulated something, and then harder because I had to get beyond my own perspective somewhat, and and look for a more of a context.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I was a little curious about is when you were looking back on the things that you had written in the 80s, did you find yourself, I guess, identifying completely with that reviewer of the time, with you of the past? Or did you sort of, like Roland Bart says, experience that film new and therefore not necessarily read the same things that you read the first time?
As much as I would like to identify my perceptions with Roland Bart, I would say that generally, I agreed with my initial perceptions. I mean, I was, in many cases, more interested in what other people had said at the time. But I think that there are very few cases in which I, let's say, got more out of a film, in retrospect than I did at the time, although there are some that, for example, Spielberg's 1941 seemed much more significant to me, looking at it later, than it did at the time. And then there were movies like the Jonathan Demme movie, Something Wild, that I really liked when I saw it. And then when I saw it again, I thought that it, just seemed much glibber, or less critical than I had imagined it was. But by and large, my taste seemed pretty constant. There were movies that I don't think I saw when they came out, but I might have seen later when I was teaching, something like First Blood. But I got an appreciation for that teaching it later. So, in other words, there was another kind of evolution that was going on in my thinking about these films because I taught a number of courses during this period too. And I should say that actually, probably a lot of the impulse for the book initially came out of these courses I was teaching at NYU in contemporary cinema.
Yeah, and I'm wondering though, in thinking back on sort of looking at a decade, for example, and thinking about where that went, because already. I mean, looking back on the 80s, you kind of, the history of the 80s, what the early 80s meant for the later 80s in terms of, did things come true, did things not come true that were sort of predicted, that kind of thing. Would that differ then from today? I mean, I want to get into a little bit about today, even though your book is primarily about the 80s. But I'm thinking, when you watch a movie today and sort of think about its context, does that work differently than looking at a movie or thinking about a movie from the 80s and having, I guess, a broader picture?
Sure. And I want to just make a comment about what first part of the question, that, of course, when I'm putting the book together, I do have a sense of where the narrative is going, which I wouldn't have had at the time. And a lot of that comes out of the structure of the book. In other words, the way that all of these books came about in a structural sense is I would be working with these chronologies. So they started as histories, although I prefer to use the word chronicle because it's more narrative in a way than a history. But yeah, I knew how the 80s were going to end up, and it did make it easier for me. For example, when I wrote about Videodrome and The King of Comedy together in one chapter, and said that these are the movies in which, in a way, the 80s become the 80s because they're addressing certain issues that come to the fore with the Reagan presidency, with the function of the media and television specifically and so on. So I wouldn't have said that. I did write about both of those movies at the time, but I didn't realize, that they were onto something new. Or if I did, I wouldn't have articulated it quite that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that. I brought that up about the narrative. Now, in terms of today, I don't see movies as much as systematically as I did in the 80s. I mean, in the 80s, I was writing, 1,000 words or more every week. So, and I was aware of everything that was coming out, whether I saw it or not. And now, I'm much pickier. I go to see things when I want to see them. I don't necessarily see them when they first come out. I don't always feel obliged to have an opinion and so on. And there are movies that I recognize as being very much of the moment, or that strike me that way. But it's not as if I am looking at them so systematically.
Yeah, well, and that makes sense because we have different objectives, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking on some level, I think if you told someone today that you're writing a book about 80s films, it might be tempting to be like, well, that's not very important for 2020 because, that's such a long time ago and things are quite different now. But also, as you sort of mentioned, especially in the epilogue, there are very sort of similar and eerie connections between the Reagan years and what are now maybe the Trump years.
Yeah.
So I'm curious in how you would describe sort of the meaning of this book and looking back on it and 80s cinema and political culture and how someone today might, or what someone today might learn from that.
Yeah, well, of course, when I began writing this book, Trump was, he wasn't even a blip on on the horizon as far as I was concerned. I started writing it during the Obama presidency. However, when I was finishing it, Trump was the president, and I was thinking about him every day. And my wife would tell me, "Oh, you have to write about Trump. You have to write about Trump." And my friend Art Spiegelman, who very graciously provided the cover for the book, initially wanted to put Trump on the cover. I said, "No, you can't do that." But so I kind of had to save that till the end. But yes, it was, right after Trump was elected, I wrote a piece which I ended up having to, it was originally going to be for the New York Review of Books, but they were inundated with Trump pieces, as you can imagine, So it ended up being published first in France, which was, an odd thing for me, but nice, which was making the point that, that Trump is not Reagan. I knew, that he was like him, but he was different. So I saved a lot of that for the back of the book. Why? Because sure. You for the second time, we have somebody who is essentially, I think, an entertainer and certainly, product of the media becoming president, and an even more unlikely one than Reagan. And, one who was useful for me, and only in this sense, in clarifying part of Reagan's appeal. And this is what I get to at the end of the book, that, Reagan, I learned in the course of writing this book, was profoundly a creature of Hollywood. And it's not just that he was in the movies, but the movies were in him. This is something that I really got, doing in the 3 days I did of research in the Reagan library, which was not unpleasant. It was like being sedated. It was just, it was quite a kind of a stupefying environment. But, I got what I could from it. And one of the things I got was that how important it was to him and Nancy, his wife, to be in touch with their former colleagues. And I realized that from their perspective, being president was, it was good. It was nice. They were happy, but that there was really nothing better than being a movie star in America in the 1940s, even if it meant you were, like a second-tier star like he was. And I also began to realize that he had internalized Hollywood's basic, fundamental message is maybe not the right word, but, Hollywood's fundamental ideological appeal, that, optimism, unity, happy endings, black and white, characterizations, all these things. And he could articulate that very well. Trump, comes out of a completely different media ecology. And it's not just that he grew up watching television, although that's part of it. I mean, Reagan, when Reagan was a star in the 40s, movie supreme mass medium, and Trump watched TV like everybody else his age. But Trump came into his own as a media figure in tabloid journalism, talk radio, professional wrestling, and reality TV. Mm-hmm. That's really different. You're not, that's not building a consensus. That's, like building a fan base, which, Reagan only got at the end. Really, after he ceased to be president, that's when he became, he developed these fanatical fans who wanted to name the airport after him and put him on Mount Rushmore and all these other mm-hmm. things. So, Trump is quite different. He's not a representative of like Hollywood optimism. He's peddling something else, a certain kind of conflict. And, one could say also that that's, it comes out of the fact that he was like me and others, was an adolescent or a young person in the 19th century, in a period when there was a lot of conflict. Although, he was kind of above that. He was a rich kid who wasn't really directly involved. But, conflict is second nature to him. And mm-hmm. something that occurred to me while I was working on the book was that, it's well known that, it's not just that Trump lies all the time, which is something that Reagan did. But in Reagan's case, it was more like spinning like a pleasing story, a scenario that people would enjoy. But, it's not Trump, just has has what you could say, a transactional relationship with the truth. But that he's the only president who's, his approval ratings never go much above 40%. I mean, that's unprecedented. He never, had, according to these polls, anything really close to a majority of the American people behind him. And you would think that would be a disturbing thing. And then I realized that, Trump doesn't think in those terms. I mean, if you had a 40% Nielsen rating, that is mm-hmm. fantastic. And that's what, he's into ratings. He gets that. So he's not concerned. Reagan would be very different.
Yeah, no, I like that part of your epilogue where you talk about that. And also I found it really interesting how you just mentioned that for Trump, love and hate are identical in terms of ratings.
Yes.
As long as people are loving or hating you, they're paying attention to you, which, as you said, is not necessarily the way Reagan would approach it.
That's absolutely true. I mean, Reagan, as an actor, naturally wanted to be liked. I mean, it sort of goes with the territory there. Trump had no problem being a heel, as they would say in wrestling.
Yeah. Does that mean, though, then, and I don't know how much you want to, talk about today because, the present, because the vast majority of the book is about 70s and 80s and Reagan. But, in terms of Reagan, like you said, Ghostbusters seems to capture that moment best. But it also is part of a sort of changing landscape in Hollywood where, you had earlier musicals and westerns, and then you get into sort of sci-fi and Jaws, and then later you have, Ghostbusters and Indiana Jones. And when we think about the 80s, we think about a certain kind of Hollywood film.
Yeah.
Do you see that starting now with the sort of Trump-era film? Like, do you think we're going to go back to the disaster movie, or will we have to go to some kind of new thing? Like, what are your thoughts on what a 2020 or that kind of era film might be?
Well, I kind of think we're living the disaster film, but
well, does that mean we need to get away from the disaster film and we'll start being more optimistic in Hollywood, or like what are your thoughts?
I don't think so. I think that the key genre or form of movie, I think, is not something that started with Trump, and that's the the superhero movies or the comic book movies, the Marvel movies. I mean, that really happens in the early aughts. Mm-hmm. The late 90s, it comes into its own during the Bush presidency. And I think there are a number of things. I mean, clearly, it has its antecedents with the movies that Lucas and Spielberg pioneered in the late 70s. Although those movies were, I don't want to call them humanist masterpieces, but they were it was somewhat more complex than the Marvel movies, although there were exceptions. But maybe they were more dimensional in a way. So that this is a kind of movie making that is driven by the economy of the movie industry, that they really have to make these international films, that it's, they want blockbusters and franchises and so on. What's significant about them is that the character is more important than the actor in all these movies. I mean, who cares who plays Batman? I mean, so many people have played Batman at this point. Doesn't matter. Batman is the is a Spider-Man. These are the costume is the star. And also that these movies are really driven by CGI, by special effects. So that is the dominant form of filmmaking. I mean, other ones, have been either rendered extinct, like the Western, which very sad to me. It's like a child who grew up with Westerns. And, that I'm unhappy that they disappeared. And in The Dream Life, I see that, I write about that they were a casualty of the Vietnam War, because it was no longer possible to even agree on anything about American history after Vietnam, and Westerns were all about that. And so what had once been, like an extremely rich source of, introspection, let's say, social introspection, no longer was viable. So you have these other movies, which occasionally, they would appeal to a certain group, have some kind of social basis, Black Panther or Wonder Woman, and maybe some other examples. But I think that are generally, not all that interesting, and don't really lend themselves to the same kind of analysis, at least by me. Mm-hmm. As these earlier films, although, some of them, clearly, the Joker is a Trump era film. And, I think it can be spoken of in those terms, but I think that movies are not all that important to him. I don't think they were that important to George W. Bush either. Clinton may have been the last president who really seemed to care about movies to any degree. And whereas Reagan, it was fascinating for me to look at what he was watching, to see what he was watching while he was president, because, he looked at them in a professional way. His movie taste, he was, was in a sense much more educated. I mean, Trump looks at Fox TV. I mean, that's what he looks at. I mean, he's sort of hooked into it. And so that's becomes much more important, really, as a social mediator or as a generator of shared fantasies or dreams than the movies do at this time.
Yeah. Well, and maybe you could say a little bit about, for me, I found it interesting, the way that Reagan would actually, literally quote Clint Eastwood, for example, right? Make my day. He would embody the heroes that he may have seen and that seemed to appeal to the base, or at least a general American who, might have seen Rocky, or might have seen the latest sort of, blockbuster. So he would model himself to an extent after those things, but he would also try to use them to prop himself up. And there you see the most, I guess, obvious intersection between Hollywood and politics. But, I mean, what does it mean for a president to quote a Western hero?
I mean, Reagan quoted movies all the time. I mean, it wasn't just, those are the most famous examples, but he was forever telling stories, anecdotes about the movies, or that, movies just were his imaginary, you could say. I mean, that's how he understood the world. So it's not like he would have to think, to quote Clint Eastwood, or, to take a quote from Back to the Future, where we're going, there are no roads, or any of the other things that he said. He didn't need Peggy Noonan to tell him to do that. He's from that world. And, he didn't see everything. For example, he seems never to have looked at any of the Arnold Schwarzenegger films, although he personally liked Schwarzenegger once he adjusted to the idea of a German movie star, and, invited him to the White House and sent him birthday telegrams and, his usual thing. But he had a feel for what Hollywood was doing at any given time. It was natural for him. What I'm saying, it's like natural for him to make these associations and to pull these lines out of the air, just like he knew how to hit his marks when he was making an appearance. He knew how to deliver a one-liner. I mean, the thing about Reagan and acting is that initially people, were particularly, the Democrats or his opponents were making fun of him. Oh, he's a second-rate actor, this and the other thing, so superficial. They didn't realize that even a second-rate actor is like head and shoulders over any other professional politician when it comes to, putting yourself forward in a public arena. I mean, they used to call him, the great communicator, but really it was that he knew how to do this stuff. They didn't know how to do it. Walter Mondale, Jimmy Carter, they couldn't do this, and that's my takeaway from Reagan and his facility, quoting one-liners from the movies, and not just from movies. I mean, he did an amazing thing when he was shot, and he was able to like will himself to walk into the hospital carrying a bullet in his gut. I mean, that took tremendous discipline. And then, of course, he collapsed as soon as he was, the cameras were not, the press wasn't there. But, when Nancy showed up, he said to her, "Honey, I forgot to duck." Now, that sounds great, but that's what Jack Dempsey said when he got knocked out by Gene Tunney in like 1928. I mean, so it just came to him that he was a creature of popular culture. And, that was he thrived in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, and as you say, it's really interesting to think about the ways that you can sort of get into Reagan's head by watching films that he had either watched as a younger person or maybe that he was watching at the time, because it tells you a lot about this sort of shared experience that even though, you're not there in the White House to see how he's making decisions, you can kind of get a glimpse into his sort of imagined world in a similar way that aspect, at least, is shared with a number of people. And I'm thinking, when you were writing reviews for movies, I think it was easy to choose them because they were the movies that were coming out that week, right? And so you had to sort of go with that. Do you have advice, I guess, for anyone who's thinking about doing something similar, maybe not as ambitious as this trilogy, but thinking about, how do I figure out what best describes, let's say, maybe the Trump era or maybe the Reagan era or some kind of moment in a culture? How do you sort of choose your films? Because as you said, like Ghostbusters really gets to the heart of a number of things, but did you have that sense immediately, or did you kind of look at a bunch of films that came out in the 80s and then came closer and closer to Ghostbusters as your choice because of, I don't know, some kind of way of narrowing the field? Like, how do you choose movies that speak to these issues?
Well, in the case of Ghostbusters, I mean, I deeply disliked it when it came out. I didn't review it. I disliked it, and, I don't know how much I articulated, a little bit maybe, but I didn't really think about it until I had to review Ghostbusters 2, which I think came out in 1989 or 1990. And then I thought back on what was going on here. So that gave me some perspective on it. I would say that it was easy to see movies that came out of the Obama period, because suddenly you had, particularly during his second term, I mean, movies that had a much more nuanced African-American perspective or characters or so on. Although then you have a movie like Get Out, which in one sense is an Obama-era movie, but in another sense, had this completely different meaning that people gave to it because they saw it, 1 month into Trump's presidency. So it's also a Trump movie too, in a way. So I think that I don't know that there's any formula for this. And I also think that pundits do this automatically now. By the 1988 election, the politicians were being covered by writers, at least in the New York Times, the two people who were covering that campaign, Frank Rich and Maureen Dowd, sort of came out of soft journalism, out of entertainment journalism. I mean, by then it was like a given that politicians were part of popular culture. And we can thank Reagan for that, although it really starts with Kennedy. But the Reagans made it completely impossible to ignore. So, you're still going to find people, pundits, writing op-ed pieces whenever a movie comes out. I don't know if it's Little Women or Queen and Slim, the movies that are out now. I mean, they're going to relate them to things that are going on. It's just one of the ways that it's something that we all share, participating in this culture as Americans. I think that if somebody was going to do this now, they would have to also take a somewhat of a longer view and see how things are changing within genres, which is something that we lost when we lost the Western, because that was the greatest genre of all, and very, very sensitive to what was going on. But I mean, that's one place that you see it. And then there's also something, Norman Mailer, who was a big influence on my thinking, both in general, but especially when I was doing the Dream Life, which actually takes its title from a phrase he used. And I think in his piece on the 64 Republican convention that nominated Barry Goldwater, he said something to the effect that I'm going to paraphrase it, so it won't be nearly as elegant as his formation. But he said, in essence, that the presidency is like a primitive office, and it inspires the members of the tribe to model themselves after the taste, the sensibility, the persona of the chief. And we do see that. I think we see it in kind of an alarming way, with the Republican politicians in the post-Trump party. But in general, his point is a good one, that as the leader of the pack, the president's taste, mentality, source of charisma, all these things filter into the culture at large and manifest themselves in various ways. So one can be alert to that. And that guided me into some degree. And I think that can serve as something. And I mention Obama because it's so obvious in the case of Obama, who, in my opinion, was probably the least likely president we ever had before Trump, who is, the anti-Obama. So that's another thing that goes on, I feel, in American culture. There's a certain kind of dialectic there.
Yeah, well, one thing I would definitely want to ask you about that I haven't yet is nostalgia, because you start off in this book talking about, among other things, American graffiti and George Lucas kind of looking back and remaking something that didn't necessarily exist. But also, the really great cover of your book by Spiegelman, I think, with Reagan as a sort of Ghostbuster symbol and a bunch of people in sheets watching a movie, could easily be redone with Trump's face. We even have Ghostbusters coming out, right now. But that, and even, Make America Great Again was sort of taken from Reagan, which was about looking at...
Yeah, he did have the again, just Make America Great. Yeah.
And let's, right?
Yes.
Let's make it. I think that was an interesting thing. I didn't realize that Trump took out the Let's Make America Great Again. But anyway, you could go from today, looking back about how great the 80s were, but the 80s were really about making it seem how great the, 50s and 60s were, and even then...
50s.
Yeah, okay. So then the 50s, I'm sure, if you wanted to look further, would be somewhat nostalgic for, the Roaring 20s or something. Mm-hmm. You have this, nostalgia and Hollywood are intimately connected, and it seems today that, and maybe from the 80s and maybe before, that politics and nostalgia are intimately connected. So I'm wondering if you could say how you sort of explore nostalgia and how you use it to think about these things from Reagan and from films, but also in general, because I think it's also tempting, at least for me, as I'm reading about your sort of critical look at nostalgia, I still sort of feel nostalgic thinking, oh, wow, the 70s were really great. I forgot about all those movies that came out, and the 80s were really great. So I'm sure that's not the point of your book, but even so, I think it's tempting even to talk about nostalgia to feel nostalgic. So how do you deal with nostalgia in this kind of work?
Well, I think that nostalgia is universal, and people are, in particular, nostalgic about the periods of their, childhood or their adolescence or their college period, whenever. I think no matter how terrible things might have been, there's a certain yearning for what's perceived of as a more innocent time. But really, it's just, when somebody was younger and the world seemed full of more full of possibilities, perhaps. I do feel, however, that the nostalgia that developed in the early 70s was maybe in some respects unique. And that's one reason why I wanted to begin this book, about the 80s well in advance, begin it in the 70s. And I think that also was a factor of the incredible disruption of the Vietnam War and the civil disturbances of the 60s, that there was this, these things were traumatic, and that there's a tendency to, I think even, Freud's, his definitions of a fetish, it's like the last thing that you see before the trauma, whatever it is. And so I think that there was a tendency to make a fetish out of the 1950s, which if you go back, the 1950s were in some respects a period full of dread and anxiety. They were prosperous, but there certainly was a dark aspect to them. It wasn't heaven on earth. And initially, this nostalgia was kind of encompassing. It didn't focus exclusively on the 50s. I went back and I got all these analyses that appeared in the popular press at the time, Time and Newsweek and so on, because, to me, those were very, in their day, were very useful for gauging, a popular mood. And they're talking about, half the country is dancing with Fred and Ginger, and the other half wanted to have a drink at Rick's Place in Castle, this kind of thing. So they were talking about just old movies, which were sort of had become enshrined thanks to television and so on. But very quickly, the nostalgia located itself on the 1950s. And you had radio stations that just were playing oldies. You know, American Graffiti is set in 1962, but the music that they're listening to is 4 or 5 years older than that. There's a nostalgia that's already built into it. And you had Grease, and you had many, many examples, you know, the fabulous 50s, I mean, and you know, to me, that was pretty clearly a way of just wanting to forget about the 60s and, you know, paper it over, not have to deal with all the things that came out of it. And, you know, I feel that a lot of those things have never been dealt with. There's still fault lines that emerged in the 1960s that have never, you know, they've been papered over to a degree, but they're still there, which is why, as I say, you know, the Western is no longer viable. So nostalgia enters as a force in popular culture. And we could say that George Lucas, you know, in American Graffiti is really instrumental in that. But at the same time, it becomes a force in politics. I mean, you know, you didn't have politicians. You know, politicians were future-oriented, if you think about it. I mean, Kennedy, obviously, with the New Frontier, but even Johnson, you know, the Great Society, and Nixon, too. They were not, you know, talking about the good old days. I mean, Nixon may have, you know, with a wink and a nod, might, you know, reminded white Southerners. But I don't think so. I think it was Reagan who pioneered nostalgia on the stump. And he was able to conjure this up, you know, because he was the great communicator. He could make people feel this. He could get a Reagan land going. The person who I think wrote best about this was Gary Wills in the 80s. I mean, you know, Reagan's sense of, you know, America as a kind of theme park with this phony airbrushed history and so on that we could get sentimental about. And I think that filled a great social need. I mean, people really didn't want to think about recent aspects of American history, let alone the prior history. I mean, something that I don't get to in this book, but which is really something that was symptomatic of the 90s when you finally had, you know, like a baby boomer president, and how, you know, a lot of these tensions came back, was the reaction against this completely unremarkable show at the Smithsonian, The West is America. Do you remember this?
It sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, I mean, it was a show of how the West was represented in popular culture and also in art. And the point of the show was that a lot of this stuff was invented. It was a mythology. You know, politicians went crazy about this. It's illuminating to go back and go over it. I wrote about it at the time in the Voice, and, you know, in the context of why Westerns couldn't be made anymore. When you saw that, how, you know, the differing attitudes towards American history, it's kind of irreconcilable. I mean, we see a lot of that still now, along with other things that have come back, you know, like the you know, the intense nativism of the 1920s suddenly, how did it come back again? You know, it's because it never left.
Just as a quick aside, have you seen The Mandalorian? It's the Star Wars show that's out now.
Oh, no. No, I'm sorry, no.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because it's interesting because it's totally a Western, but it's in space, you know, like Star Wars, except this one is clearly modeled on more of a serial Western where maybe Gunsmoke or something like that. It's such a clear Western motif, but of course, the Americanness is stripped out of it because they're in outer space. Yeah. But it would be interesting to think about where the Western has gone because, you know, it hasn't quite disappeared. It's not in the West anymore, not in the American West.
I think that was true even at the time, that people were, you know, talking about the original Star Wars as a kind of Western, and there were some sort of some space Westerns after that. But, you know, this reminds me of a Western on cable TV. I'm forgetting the title, but it's modeled after The Godfather. I find that, you know, significant. I mean, and this is something actually that I wrote about recently. I mean, it's amazing to me that the favorite movie of American politicians and presidents used to be High Noon. At least they said it was. I mean, Clinton being the one, you know, he claimed to watch it 20 times. I mean, they all were into High Noon, and you can understand why that would appeal to a politician. But now it's The Godfather. And I became aware of this when I was just seeing, you know, when they go through this thing when, you know, during the 2016, when they were just asking, you know, these candidates what their favorite movie was. And they're always mentioned The Godfather. And this is highly significant because who are you going to identify with in The Godfather? You know, so there's no Gary Cooper figure. And you sort of have to be identifying, I guess, with either a kind of family-based but ultimately ruthless form of capitalism or a very melancholy view of America as a gangster empire. And that's a change.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. As you wrap this up and think about other projects perhaps or things to take on, what does the future look like for you?
Well, there still are movies that I like to write about. I mean, I did write something about The Godfather. I would like to write something about The Joker. And, there are a lot of foreign films or independent films that I see that, I'm interested in writing about, although they're hardly blockbusters. But in terms of my own projects, I'm planning to do a monograph on Duck Soup, the Marx Brothers film, which was my favorite movie when I was 15. And I just wanted to write something about it now. And then other than that, I'm not sure that I want to write about current movies in any systematic way. I'm not sure what I want to do next. I mean, I'm thinking more in terms maybe of writing something about the underground culture in New York in the 60s, something that I was like old enough to be aware of, but too young to participate in. I have to build up a certain amount of energy before trying another book. They don't get easy, at least for me. They don't get easier to write.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, because I was just admiring sort of how large and imposing this book is, and yet how easy it seems that you did it. That's me looking at the final product.
Yeah.
It just seems like super simple, and I wish I was thinking I could write like that. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of work behind the scenes.
No, you didn't have to be subjected to me complaining all the time. For the years that I was working on it. But
yeah. But no, you have a great body of work already, and I look forward to seeing what else you produce. And I'll have to check out this Godfather thing. Where was that published?
And that was published in tablet, and I can send you the link if you.
Sure, I can. Yeah, I'll definitely find that.
And what I should have said when we were talking about it is that it takes us right to. I mean, the idea of America as like a gangster place. I mean, that we wind up with Trump also in this crime family that installed itself. So.
Yeah, maybe that will become the new gangster films of the 2020s.
Yeah, well, the only one that I can think of now is, which I haven't seen, is the Safdie brothers film, which is a smaller film, but I should see that too.
Well, anyway, thank you so much for speaking to me about your book, Make My Day. It's been really enlightening to think more about this subject and how, thinking about Reagan today may be even more sort of important or illuminating than before.
Yeah, well, thanks for giving me the opportunity.
As always, thank you very much for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Don't forget to check out tinapp.org, where you can see Jim's recommendations for 5 books that he would encourage people to read. You can see those and click on those and even order them if you want to from the website. While you're there, if you want to check out any of the other interviews or click on the Buy Me a Coffee button, it's always appreciated. That stuff keeps the podcast going, especially with the fees of internet and web hosting and buying books and all the good stuff that you have to pay for and that doesn't come free. Thank you as always for listening to this podcast and for encouraging the work that we do here. Make sure you share and retweet and read Facebook and whatever. Let people know about this podcast. I really appreciate it. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.